Thank you so much for joining us again. This is, I think, our 5th installment.
Something like that.
5 or 6. Yeah,
we
got a good pace going here. So thank you for joining us. I am Emileena of the Show Goes On Productions. I am a coach for artists in development, and I'm writing a book called The Tao of Artist Development, which plays into our topic today of Taoism. And I am joined by the great Nikki Johnson, who is a philosopher and discussion leader and writer and all kinds of cool things, writing a book about the internal process of enlightenment, where you focus on science and anatomy. And anything else you want to add?
Yeah, actually 2 books now.
Oh, that's right.
And the second shorter one, which will be more graphic style, is Self-Realization Science, the Anatomy of Enlightenment. But yeah, again, both the same subject. So this process that takes place within the human body to trigger the sensations and the experiences that so many different traditions in spirituality and philosophy and psychology associate with enlightenment under many different names. So,
yeah. Awesome. So you're the perfect person to talk to about Taoism. So, so let's get started.
Yes.
So I've always been super drawn to Taoism. I wanted to start with kind of the difference between how I see Buddhism and Taoism, because that's like, I think in America, especially, that's a lot of people don't really just assume it's kind of like Buddhism.
I think that's a great, that's a great starting place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the way I kind of, what?
Yeah, for a lot of people, all the Asian religions are
exactly
this.
Which they're very similar in all fairness, but I think the fundamental difference, as far as I'm concerned, is that in Buddhism, it's all about trying to achieve nirvana, which we know that you can't do in one life. It's about going through each life, and in each life you're struggling. It's about the struggle with samsara and materialism and all of these things. And you have to go through that struggle over a period of lifetimes before you can achieve nirvana. But in Taoism, it's that you're kind of the idea in my mind is that you are inherently connected to nirvana. But what they don't call it nirvana, they would call it, a Taoist would call it the Tao, which is the path, literally translated into the path. But it also is basically just about this, not the path, I'm sorry, the way. They call it the way. It could be called a number of different things, but it's really like collective consciousness, or this life force and energy, this inner, this energy that we all partake in. And
or I saw maybe some other synonyms to the path, the root, that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to definitely talk about how it's all about interpretation. And what's cool about Taoism is that all interpretations are correct. So however you would label it, other people would call it the divine. The divine is the Tao, and so you could even say that instead of, they also don't really have gods, but you could call it God even, or the spiritual world, whatever it is. It's about, for me, I would call it energy, this collective consciousness of energy, of which we are all a part of, we all share. And so, I think it's comparable to nirvana in Buddhism. But the difference is that in Taoism, we can connect into it. We are at any moment experiencing nirvana because we are a part of it. We are nirvana. So it's about connecting into it.
Yeah, that's a clear distinction between the two, where Buddhism is all about suffering, and this seems like it's the exact opposite, going with the flow, right? Yeah.
Yes, I love it. So I discovered the Tao Te Ching, which is like their holy book, I guess, in college in this religious diversity class. And it's interesting because I read the Tao Te Ching and I made notes, and I just gave the book to a friend maybe a couple of years ago at this point. And she's reading it, and she's like, "I'm reading your notes in the margin."
Ooh, that's always fun.
Yeah, right.
With other people,
It's not what you've been saying Taoism is. And so I kind of looked back over it, and it's interesting because I definitely did not understand it at all.
I love when this happens. Yeah, revisiting old notes, or old pieces of writing. Yeah,
it's interesting to see where I was and to see my interpretation, and especially in Taoism, where no interpretation is incorrect. It would be like my interpretation of the Tao back then. And that was also very early on in my spiritual development, if you will. So I just didn't have capacity, the like intellectual capacity for what is this idea of collective consciousness, even, you know?
But at the same time, I
Yeah.
see the same thing going on with Christianity, which was my background.
Yeah.
So, you know, at the third dimensional level, you
Mhm.
have Christ being a person.
Right.
Whereas I think, you know, as you start to move into the fourth dimensional level, he becomes more of a concept of unconditional love and treating others as we would wish to be treated. You know, as you start moving into that fifth dimensional level, well, now it becomes this process that takes place within the human body. So, you know, similar to what you're saying about all of these ways being correct,
Right.
that's the beauty of
Yes.
these pieces of scripture, these different, you know, schools of thought in terms of spirituality, where it works
Yeah.
at these different levels wherever you're at, and it's designed like that. That's part of the divine plan. So
Yeah.
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 So,
And
so it's not to say that you were wrong at that
right.
point.
No,
Absolutely
totally.
not.
Well, and actually, another
yeah.
word I would say for collective consciousness, energy, nirvana, love. I
Yes.
actually think love could also encapsulate that.
I've heard that view too. Yeah. That the universe is made of energy, which you can
Right.
call that information, you can call that love, you can at the end of the day it becomes a semantic issue in some ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that was what definitely drew me to Taoism in the very beginning. Was I'd never liked boundaries. I never liked being put into a box.
Me neither.
So, right. So here was the one religion that, or way of life anyways, that allowed for everything. And that was really freeing to me. So,
you know, I was going to ask, so was this something that you were introduced to by your parents, or is this something you discovered later in life?
No, in fact, I hope at least one parent is watching right now, so he can learn about it. No, I don't think either one understands Taoism. No one in my family. In fact, very few people I know understand what Taoism is, which is why I was so excited to do this. I just randomly felt this really powerful connection with it. And I've called myself a Taoist probably since that time, even not understanding it fully. I've just felt really drawn to it. I grew up Christian as well.
Yeah.
So, my dad's kind of into Buddhism a little bit, and Hinduism. He lived in India, so I was exposed to Hinduism and Jainism even, and Buddhism.
I love that one too. Yeah.
But not necessarily. We went to church for sure, you know, and it was never sat down and taught Buddhism or anything. I just kind of picked up on it from all the like idols my dad collected, you know. Not because he worshipped them, you know.
Sure. But I think this is such a helpful dynamic, actually, to come from, you know, the Western side of religion and being grown up in that ideology, and then to be introduced to the Eastern in terms of achieving that balance between the two. So I mean, it was the same for me. Cool. Yeah, that's the ideal at the end of the day. So cool.
Yeah. So I also wanted to start with a quote, which I think encapsulates this idea of it all being about interpretation. It's a quote from the Tao of Pooh, which is a great book. I definitely recommend it. Benjamin Hoff. For some reason, Winnie the Pooh is like the perfect example of Taoism and all the characters. So it breaks it down into bite-sized pieces that, you know, anyone can understand. But
was the author Taoist? Probably not necessarily.
He grew up, Benjamin Hoff. Yeah, I think he grew up with it. He's not devout necessarily, whatever that means, you know, but he definitely grew up with it.
Or influenced by it.
Strongly influenced by it. He doesn't go into the book what it is. And actually, this quote perfectly encapsulates it. So he says at the beginning of the book, a basic principle of Lao Tzu, he's the one who wrote the Tao Te Ching, by the way. A basic principle of Lao Tzu's teaching was that this way of the universe, or the Tao, could not be adequately described in words, and that it would be insulting both to its unlimited power and to the intelligent human mind to attempt to do so. Still, its nature could be understood, and those who cared the most about it and the life from which it was inseparable understood it best. I love that, right? Because like words do not do justice. And that's what was my experience with it. I didn't even read the Tao of Pooh until like a couple of years ago. So that was relatively new to me, but that was totally been my experience. The more I learned about it, the more I'm like, oh, I get it. And it isn't words. Words also, you know, you just kind of connect into this Tao.
Yes. But also just with any scripture, I feel like you absorb a certain level of knowledge just by the words themselves on a
Yes.
conscious level. But most of the scripture, there's so much subtext there that you
Right.
also absorb at the same time.
Exactly.
So, yeah, and that's where the real power is. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the text too, but I want to start with a short history and then go into the three parts, the three not branches, the three parts of Taoism, which I think are fundamental to what it is, and then end with like a little conclusion. Cool. So just starting from the history of it, it grew in popularity around the 4th century BCE in response to Confucianism, which was the national religion, and it really was also a way of life. And it was strict, and it was rigid, militaristic. It was in the school systems because that kind of it provided a strict structure for their school systems. And it was about worshiping their ancestors. And it was very, you know, kind of structured. So along came Taoism, which was the perfect kind of response to that.
Yeah, and it sounded like one of the main distinctions too with Confucianism, and if you get into a whole section of this later, stop me.
Yeah.
But it sounded like Confucianism was about, okay, the external controls the internal, or that sort of side of it, and this was the other side.
Yes.
Of the economy, kind of a pole shift.
Absolutely.
You know? Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. That's a great way of looking at it. And it makes sense. It helps you understand Taoism, knowing that what it grew out of and what it was in response to. You know, and it's disputed who actually wrote the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu is only the reputed author. Some people think multiple people wrote it.
I read there's 3 different men who might be Lao Tzu.
Right. Okay. Right, exactly. It's like Shakespeare. Nobody
But you know, this happens so often in history. You look at Pythagoras, who may or may not have existed.
Exactly.
People would attribute so many things to him, but we're not even sure whether he was a real person at the end of the day. You know, you have Shakespeare, who could have been Francis Bacon, you know.
Right, yeah. These major influences. It helps to have one person as a representative, though. And his story is, and actually that's kind of like the Bible too, just to say really quickly, to draw that parallel, which is just different stories, you know, although the Tao Te Ching is not stories, but we'll get to that. But anyways, Lao Tzu has his own story, which is why he's kind of perfect for this. It's similar to the Buddha, where he gave up his life of privilege and he went to live a life of lack, you know, in nature. And when he kind of cut out everything from his life, he released attachments, is when he supposedly sat down in nature and wrote the Tao Te Ching.
Yeah, and so it's very similar to the Joseph Campbell monolith and everything. Yeah, these sort of same cycles come up archetypally in many different traditions.
I think actually Confucius too has a similar story.
Yeah, the monomyth. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Exactly. So, and then another thing I want to touch on is the big question of, is it T Taoism or is it D Taoism? You know, they're both used interchangeably. So there is no direct translation of the Chinese character, which is why we use D. So it's kind of more American to use the D because we say Taoism. It's kind of, it doesn't roll off the tongue to say Taoism. You know, it's Taoism.
It was similar when I lived in Israel. I mean, you have, when you translate it into English, you have a million different spellings of the same thing. Right. It's closely approximated. Yeah.
Exactly. And they all mean the same thing. There's not really a big difference, except that I did find a great article, which I will post in the notes, from this guy who's the Taoist Hawaiian transformation coach, Casey Cockmer, and on the website personaldao.com, and he has a discussion about the difference, and he sees it as the nuance is a little bit more Americanized, the D. And the reason why I like the D personally is because it kind of stands on its own. It's a little different from what we're traditionally seeing. And I think Taoism with the T, people think it is this idea that's untouchable. They don't really understand it. It's Chinese, it's Eastern, it's like confusing. They don't really get it. So I'm kind of trying, and I'm writing a book called The Tao of Artist Development. So I'm trying to kind of rebrand it a little bit and say this is accessible to Americans. It's actually very American in its heart, because it's all about accepting everything. It's like this is the only country in theory where, we're the land of opportunity, right? So in my mind, I like this idea. I mean, it gives it a negative connotation with some people, and there's certainly purists who will, find this disgusting.
Right. But there's Americans.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm American, so what can I say? But one of the things that Casey Cockmer says on his website, which I really like, is he says, if you cannot accept yourself, you cannot be yourself. Which I think, right? So I think that's kind of, I'm American. We are American. And I have lots of problems with Americans, but I think that this is, for me, I want to kind of take it and own it and go with it. So I tend to use D, but it doesn't really matter. It feels modern and relevant. So, and I also want to read, when I was researching my blog originally, when I wrote a blog about Taoism, I tried to find, because as I said, I don't know many people who subscribe to Taoism who even understand it. So I started, right?
Yeah, to be honest, I've done comparative religious studies, and so I knew about it. It comes up very often, and every time I see it, it's like, wow, yeah, I totally resonate with that principle. But I've never, or maybe at a certain point during the journey, but yeah, to go in right now and look at it in singular form, right?
Yeah,
exactly. I totally understand why this resonates with you. And there's I mean, in terms of like how it fits with quantum physics and a lot of these other topics that we're talking about, and the self-sovereignty and everything. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah. So I found this Yelp review. The closest thing I could find is there's some Taoist temples in New York. So I thought that was cool, and I could in theory go. When I went on Meetup, by the way, I only found a bunch of tantric groups associated with Taoism. So, very sexual. So that's the direction I was going in. But Taoists by nature, I think, are very isolationist. And this is a Yelp review of a Taoist temple, and I love it because I think it just sums it up. So she says, I walked into the temple just out of curiosity. I was pretty much invisible and no one even glanced my way. I walked around a bit. I must admit, I don't know much about the Taoist belief. I still have no clue after my visit. And I'm like, exactly. But that's why I love it, because it's about where what you identify with, So had she chosen to sit down and meditate, for instance, then she could have found her own Tao. That's how you tap into the way.
But instead of dictating to people, this is what it is.
Right.
Taoism allows you to create your own interpretation. That's beautiful. Yeah, but that's so contrary to what we in Western culture are used to, where again, it's about the external dictating the internal versus the other way around. Yeah. Yeah,
and that's definitely why I identified with it. And I think that's why Taoists tend to be kind of isolationists, because it's a matter of like finding yourself in the context, I think, which is nice. So, okay. So part one, I'd say, as far as the 3 parts of Taoism, is all about nature. This Tao that is this universal energy that connects us all, making us all, hashtag we are one. And this is the same energy as the earth itself. And I've always said nature is a great teacher if you let it be, And so I think all life lessons can be found metaphorically in nature. If we look for it, if we open our eyes, we can find it. So I have 3 kind of quick examples of how you can, like, examples in nature. So one is a friend of mine who for a while was kind of fixated on this idea of green things like plants, grass growing out of rock. And he's like, that's so weird to me because rock is dead, and he specifically, there was like this waterfall that was all rocks, and dead underneath the water. And yet, especially because it was under a waterfall, there's a screen coming through. And so he was just fixated on for a while, and he kept meditating on it, trying to figure it out. But if you think about it, it's this beautiful metaphor for what can grow out of anything, right? And he himself happened to be coming out of some life traumas, and he was able to himself grow, find a birth and grow into something beautiful, even though he had experienced all these other parts of him were dying.
Aww.
So,
Yeah, that is a beautiful story. Yeah. But
exactly.
also, in terms of rocks, so crystals are actually considered the first dimension. So you do have,
cool.
yeah, and
I didn't know.
animals are second dimension.
Okay.
So then we have the third and the fourth and the fifth that we were talking about before. So.
Right. And so you can look to those things to, as to discover your own version of it. You know, that would be, I'd say, that's very Taoist, is to look to nature to kind of for these life lessons. Another quote that I love from Lao Tzu is, nature does not hurry, and yet it is always on time.
Yes.
Right?
That's lovely.
In New York, it's like, you know, we're always rushing. And it's true, if you look at a tree, you know, it's like a tree is going to grow into something beautiful or, you know, whatever. And it's not in a rush. There's no rush. And it just, so, and I think it's a perfect metaphor for us. You know, we don't need to rush. We're going to grow into what we're going to grow into. So, and then the last one, which is particularly relevant in times of pandemania, like we are now, is that nature always finds a way. So here's a pop culture reference from Jurassic Park, the original Jurassic Park, you know, when they all the dinosaurs are female. So they're like, they'll never, you know, breed, and they're never going to grow bigger. And Jeff Goldblum is like, yes, life will find a way. And he says, and the scientist says, are you insinuating that a group of females could breed? And he says, no, I'm saying life will find a way. I don't know how it's going to do it, but it will find a way. And of course,
chaos theory. Yeah,
chaos theory. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I thought about looking at that clip too. I'm going to post the life finds a way clip. The chaos theory one is slightly goes in a different direction, but it is the same idea of that, you know, life will find a way. And there was this great off-Broadway show in 2012 called Jurassic Park, which was a coming of age story of like the first male dinosaur in all the female dinosaurs. And it's this like gender identity confusion. And he's like, what am I? You know, so sweet. So that's what we love for indie theater. Support indie theater. You could probably license it. But yeah, so life will always find a way. And that's what will happen with us out of this pandemania. Life will go on, you know.
Pandemic.
Yeah. I call it pandemania because
okay. All right.
You know,
now we're branding it. Okay.
Yeah, but you know, we will survive social distancing, virtual events, and even an economic collapse. We will survive and we will move on.
The cycles of nature, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So, and then another comparison, a good nature reference is Neil deGrasse Tyson, you know, in his Cosmos series, says we were all made of stardust because we share the DNA traits, I think specifically atoms, with plants, meteors, you know, and and all of that.
Yeah. And then we get into separation consciousness. The only reason that we see one another as separate objects or whatever is the way the brain is wired. So but all the same stuff at that fundamental level, at that mathematical level.
Right. We are one. And we can tap into that at any time, you know, if we quiet our brain, quiet that part of the brain. It's already in there instead of fighting it. Again, in Buddhism, you have to fight it. In Taoism, it's like just quiet it and tap in. And again, it's really easy it's easier to do in nature. You have the silence of nature, you know? So yeah, that's good. And then, and then, so because we are one, you know, that's why it's important for us to support each other through these times, like COVID times, because then we can collectively move forward as a species. And I know that is more difficult for some races, for instance, than for others. But that's why I really like the nonviolence movement, which I think is a whole nother topic into itself. But I wanted to reference here because that is about relinquishing control of circumstances, but not condoning it. And I think that's really important, at least the nonviolence movement. And again, I'm getting slightly off topic here, but I think to use that as a metaphor for your life, you know, we have to release this idea that we can control our circumstances. And again, nature is really great for this. And we don't necessarily have to say it's okay what is happening to me. You know, maybe I'm not okay with having to socially distance, but I can move forward in peace, hence the nonviolence movement.
Yeah. But I mean, non-action seems like it's one of the central pillars of
Yes.
Taoism. Okay, okay. Are you getting into more of that
No, I
later?
don't have to talk about non-action.
Oh, okay.
I could go on for hours.
Sure,
But
sure. There's so
nonviolent
much juicy stuff
non-action,
here.
kind of the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
thing, actually.
Okay,
So that's good.
okay.
And then lastly, in the nature section is this like the philosophical analogy of the ocean. You know, we are all but waves coming out of an ocean for our day in the sun, and then we will rise from and return to that whence we came, which is the ocean. We are one.
Right.
So that's my favorite part, is that we are definitely one. And so the Tao is this, right, we have to, because it's this universal energy, we have to give up control, this non-action, in order to tap into it. I don't usually use the words non-action, but I think what I'm saying is basically the same thing.
It's so funny because so many different sources that talk about this,
Yeah.
the language differs so
Yeah.
much. But
I
maybe
know.
it's coming through different
Different
slightly different
lenses.
areas.
Mhm.
Yeah. Or I mean, it's been so long too since it was formed that these things evolve sometimes through different paths. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And they're all correct, which, you know, because again, it's beyond words. Like from the Tao of Pooh quote, you know, it's really beyond words. It's what you feel and what you tap into.
Ooh, that might be the other element too,
Yeah.
though.
Yeah.
Going back to what we were saying before, where they kind of step back and allow people to create their own interpretation.
Yeah.
So, unlike more of the Western religions or
Mhm.
potentially
Mhm.
Confucianism,
Mhm.
going about it the opposite way, where this is the way it is, the structure, the control. This allows people to interpret it for themselves, and
Yeah.
so because of that, you have these different interpretations that have then taken off. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
And that's what drew me to it. I think probably for me personally was a rebellion against being told what I needed to do. You know, my sister went to a Christian elementary school where they were like, you know, you have to, they were so strict and rigid, you know,
Right.
they got
The
her out of every
ruler and
class, you know? Yeah, I remember being told, I remember in Sunday school being told that you can't just say, when you're praying, you can't just say, I love you, Lord. You have to say it loud and say it proud. So I would go to bed every night and be like, I love you, Lord, you know, like a crazy lady, because I thought that that's what I was told I had to do, you know?
Yeah. That it's cool that you brought that up too, because for me, that was the difference in my interpretation between what I felt like my Christian indoctrination was versus when I discovered spirituality too, and these other religions and started exploring those areas. It
Yeah,
felt like Christianity, at least the version that I got at the time,
right,
was
right.
dictating this is how things should be.
Mhm.
Whereas I felt like with spirituality is like, oh, this is explaining how they are
Well,
versus,
word. Oh, I love
yeah,
that. More present.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, that's cool. I like that.
yeah,
People struggle with that. That's one of the reasons why I think I like you so much and I think we connect is because you were just inherently there.
yeah,
And I think so many people struggle with that. So I actually love that.
yeah.
And it reminds me
Part
of a
of
child saying, yeah.
part of it was, so my mom was very firm Catholic, and
Mm,
then my dad, he was Lutheran by label but more agnostic, I feel, and
okay.
so that created the little piece of cognitive dissonance that just kind of sat there, unawakened until later adulthood, and then that spurred a lot of this exploration.
Okay,
So
cool.
yeah, but I mean, all purposeful, I
Yeah,
feel.
absolutely. It's
Yeah,
all
yeah,
right. It's all right.
yes.
And that speaking of releasing the control, there's a great Taoist saying that fish do not swim, they are swum or carried. And
Okay.
birds do not fly, they are flown. And this is the idea of relaxing into nature. Because
Yeah.
actually feng shui, which is kind of, actually comes out of Taoism too. I think, I wrote it somewhere. The feng means wind, I think, and shui means something else. And it's this idea of letting the natural elements carry you.
Right.
So I
And
really like
and
that.
identifying with the whole, it sounds
Yes,
like, as
we are
well,
one.
instead of the
Exactly.
individual parts. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. Yeah.
So yeah. Okay, so part two. Um, is duality, this idea of yin yang, which is also obviously huge. So the Tao Te Ching as a holy book text is really just a bunch of opposing statements coupled next to each other. So that's why it's so abstract, I think. And so, for instance, something like, and this is not a direct quote, this is probably a gross simplification, but it's like life thrives in the sun, life thrives in the moon, you know. And then it's like, and then I think the purpose of it is to contemplate, to sit, meditate, and contemplate on both. And by looking at both sides, you inherently, I think, will find the middle.
And the description that I saw in terms of Taoism for this element, it's so Jungian, you know, the complementary and opposing elements that, you know, support one another. Oh, I mean, the two go together really well.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. I'm not that familiar with Jung, more through the
yes.
Okay, nice. I love it. Oh, and then also obviously all things in moderation. It's about finding balance. And I know a lot of practices help you kind of do that.
Which goes really well with what we were talking about with the chakras. They're not overactive, not underactive, but right there.
Exactly. And that's how you find your Tao.
Yes.
So, you know, in college, I was told that I always contradicted myself. I made these like contradicting statements, and I was always like, but I mean both. I really mean both. And I didn't understand why that was so hard for everybody else. And I think, again, it's this like Taoist inside of me. You know,
you had this was open a bit. Yeah. And I mean, you've been increasingly opening it more and more, but no, people in that third dimensional level, it is solely binary. You can only start to see what you're talking about in that fourth dimensional level.
Oh, cool.
The higher chakras, true. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And the way I found my Tao, the way I cultivated that was really pushing the extremes and pushing the boundaries. Now, of course, this is, you know, only compared to some. I have not lived a life as an extreme as a lot of other people, but my versions of extremes is what has brought me to the middle. So, and I also think, you know, because I would bounce back, by going there, I would bounce back. And then also I think hate and love are two sides of the same coin. Right? Because you can only truly hate somebody that you are feeling something for. Otherwise, you discard them.
Right. But that's, again, you seeing it this way.
Yeah, because a lot of people have a hard time with that one.
Yeah.
So, great.
This is a key insight, though, into that transition where you can see both opposites of the coin as being a sliding scale on one spectrum. Yeah. Oh, that's huge.
Awesome. Okay, so part 3 is judgment. So this one I've kind of thrown in there myself. I'm sure there's other words for you know that Taoists will use, but it's, in my mind, it's about releasing judgment, because there is no good, there is no bad, there only is. And that one is also really challenging, but because that means giving up the attachments. So for instance, actually, before I go into the examples, I'll just say that Buddha, Lao Tzu, and Confucius, you know, and all of these people, that's what they were able to do, is by giving up the attachments. That's how they were able to find enlightenment. So I'll actually suggest an alternative to that, but you don't have to do that to get there, because again, in Taoism, it's always there. But, you know, so for good, the attachments we have to good are things like social gatherings, right? Or ice cream, you know, any kind of cravings.
Oh my God, I have that one so bad.
Oh my God, I know, ice cream is worse for me.
Terrible.
And then bad this is what people have a really hard time with giving up, is like things that are bad: war, murder, racism, sexism. There only is. And this is where I also like to reference the nonviolence movement, because it's not condoning it, it's just releasing the attachment. And I'm not even saying that you have to give up things like ice cream, for instance, or, you know, or you have to go out and support war. It's just a matter of living with it with non-judgment and accepting it with non-judgment. you know, and for me, the way because all things are transitory, right? We know that. That's actually very Buddhist. You know, we're all going to die at some point. We know that. So it's like there are the ebbs and flows of life. So in theory, if you can find your Tao in the middle there, you can kind of ride those ins and outs. And for me, I struggled, the way I found out was I struggled so much with the bad, and being an empath, it was so hurtful and so intense that I was willing to give up the good.
Yeah. I'm
Right?
an empath too, so I hear you.
Yeah, and again, all things are relative, so I'm sure people would, you know, I've had a very easy life, and I have had a very easy life compared to a lot of people, but that was kind of my journey, you know, and bad means something different to everybody else, you know,
Mhm.
so there's no wrong here.
And easy means different things to everybody as well. You know,
What
there's
does,
easy
oh,
and
easy.
tough, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. We all
Oh
have
my gosh, yes.
easy some ways and tough other ways, you know, and a different
Absolutely. That's
tolerance for
very
all these
important.
things. Yeah.
And actually, for the record, the people who I think argue that and get hung up on that are the people who are attached to judgment, because that is a judgment. Oh, that's not easy. Well, that's a judgment. You know? So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think Taoism is a healthy tool for managing trauma. And that's actually part of the reason why I think I am drawn to working with artists, because I think artists disproportionately experience a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
In addition to being an artist myself, obviously. But it certainly, Taoism, and especially releasing judgment, doesn't apply to everybody. But it is accessible to everybody. It's available should somebody choose to tap in. And you don't need education. This is also why I was really drawn to it. You don't need education. You don't have to study forever on it. You don't have to go through intense training. You just practice quieting your mind and looking within.
Yeah, but I feel like there's two reasons why giving up judgment is so difficult for humans. One, the brain is hardwired to do that.
Yes.
Look at something, we label it. Yeah.
Yes.
And two, I mean, this is what society does as well. So
yeah,
goes into
exactly. And that's what I say in my book, and to artists. And I think that's why artists have it disproportionately more difficult, is because society has been so harsh, you know, in the last 10, 12 years as funding is cut. And what it means to be a successful artist is there, and, you know, exploitation takes over and blah, blah, blah. I'm writing a book on it, so I won't go. I have a comment though, which is exciting. It says Honore says, The Good Place on NBC has a nice wave explanation related to what you said a bit ago. Oh, nice. And she gave it a link. So I'll take a look at that link and include it in.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah, I think the wave is I think she's referring to the ocean metaphor.
Oh yeah, I love that metaphor.
Yeah. So, okay, so I'm at the end here, and then do you want to add anything before I kind of get to my conclusion?
Oh, I was just going to ask a couple.
Yeah.
I mean, dude, the connections with quantum physics and the way it works so well with that. I mean, that's one of the things that really jumped out at me. So, you know, that everything exists as aspects of chi. And so as in condensed form, it becomes life. So this is the particle, and then diluted, it's infinite potential. So this is the wave. So I mean, we have wave particle duality there.
Yeah, how fascinating.
Yeah.
Chi is basically your energy, right?
Yes.
Is how you would interpret. Yeah.
The energy of everything.
Right.
That layer that we were talking about, where the star stuff, if you will.
Yeah.
So
cool. Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that. And then, but yeah, and what you were saying too about, well, it seems like there's the relativity of time is certainly an element of this as well. So when you were talking in a previous episode about how you change tenses, and if this is a bit of your early background or whatever, maybe you discovered it later, but you still had it there in the back of your mind.
Teachers did not hesitate to tell me.
Right. But you knew. Yeah.
Right.
All time is simultaneous.
And
that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And actually I do kind of have that, because my conclusion is like how to cultivate your own Tao. And one of my suggestions is kind of cultivating this idea of time is relative, which takes time. For me, the idea was introduced to me at one point, and it took me about a year to 2 years to really sit and get that time is relative. Time really is relative.
Oh, it's not a human concept. And again, third dimension, you cannot process this whatsoever. Even in four dimension, it's still super vague. And yeah, you have to get to the point where you pop the top a little bit on that pineal gland and that DMT starts shooting in, that you can even vaguely conceptualize these types of ideas.
Yeah, but it definitely makes the releasing judgment easier. Because it's like, if you're not there now, it doesn't, you will get there at some point, and because time is relative, it's like you're already there, even though you're not there yet. I mean, it's hard. We should do a whole episode on time being relative.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But, maybe I'll save this story until that.
Right. Okay. What else you got?
Question. I mean, one of the toughest things I think is that concept of non-action, and so it seems like there's multiple meanings for it as well. So in some cases, it's more going with the flow, which makes intuitive sense. But you stop and you go. Have you ever seen Mr. Nobody, that movie?
No, that's on my list, but you know what? They took it off of Netflix.
It's so good. I feel like I have to revisit that. I saw it back in 2015. It's one that I have to go back to. Yeah, but basically the main concept of that, though, is, the point of choice is when you have the splitting of timelines. So this idea of non-action, I don't know, for whatever reason, Mr. Nobody came into my head. And I feel like I struggle with this issue myself of, when you're going along with the flow and you have to make a choice, and
I do too. How do you
even really like either of these options necessarily? But what do you do? Or the other question that I had.
Well, let me just do a quick answer to that. What I do is when I'm having a hard time making a decision, my mantra is now that it's not going to hurt to take more time to decide. So I always wait on it. And again, time is relative. So I'm like, if I'm going to lose an opportunity before I'm ready to make the decision, then that's my decision. And
it wasn't right either,
exactly,
if you're willing to let it go. That makes sense.
And if I take a few days, and the more aligned I am with the Tao, or being in the moment is another one of these ways you can do it. Just zooming in on the moment. The more aligned I am, the more it will come to me. It's like when we get impatient, is when we can't make the decisions. We get stuck probably in the lower dimensions, and we have the voices. So when you can quiet, and also I meditate too, because then I'm like, I need to quiet everything and give it time. I think it's, again, being attached to this time, and then knowing that it will come to me, trusting it will come to me. And more than often, I don't even need to make the decision. The decision will be made.
Yeah.
Something will happen.
That makes a ton of sense to me too. And it kind of goes back to what we said in a previous episode, where the ego mind is sort of, urgent and I need and whatever, whereas the voice of intuition is calmer and can let things go and goes with the flow. It's very Taoist. Yes.
It does not hurry, and yet it's always on time.
Cool. What was the second half of my question? What happens if we're going with the flow of life and it seems like it's headed in a direction that we don't want to go in?
That's judgment.
So it's fine.
Yeah, it is never wrong. I keep saying this is like my mantra to people that I love, whenever they start freaking out. I'm like, it's not wrong. You're doing everything right. It feels wrong because you are judging it as wrong. You are never making the wrong decision. What I do believe happens is that sometimes I do think we live spirally, which I don't have time too much to get into, but for women, I think are more spiral than men, which I got out of Christopher Vogler's book, The Writer's Journey, which is about the hero's journey, but for writers. And because men tend to go straight. But anyways, so the idea about being circular, let's just stay there for a second, this idea of a spiral, is that if what we want is not here right now, we have to trust that we'll circle back to it. And I really,
that spiral is definitely
yeah,
very,
right? Spirals are perfect.
But,
I want that to be the cover of my book.
but there is a sense of course correction sometimes. I mean, I've been caught in the same cycle, and finally, okay, I don't want this to happen again. I feel like that's not necessarily a judgment. That is then.
Yeah, but that's also, that will happen naturally. I believe that it will happen naturally. Now, some of us need a few more spirals to get there, you know, because we try to control it. Sometimes we try to control it and we go off course, but even controlling it and going off course, it will come back around. There is no wrong. I really, really believe that.
Yeah.
It will come back around. It just might take longer, but time is relative anyways.
Yeah. Yeah. So whitewater rafting in Costa Rica on the Pooh.
Yeah.
That place is amazing. It's one of the best in the world. And so, but yeah, the coolest thing is that sometimes it would look like we were headed like straight toward a rock, and then the water just flows around. It's so nice. So that probably gets into what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And that is, by the way, a perfect example of Taoism, because you found the metaphor in nature.
Yeah. Done.
Yeah.
Cool.
Which is why it's so interesting to me that, by the way, is that we had trouble finding images for Taoism that were representative in nature.
Well, it was just strange. Literally, anyone who's watching, go ahead and look up Taoism and go to images. It's literally all super Chinese things. It was like, well, it's more of the way of nature. It's so funny, but I think it goes back to exactly what we were talking about toward the beginning about allowing this religion to be what it is for people, allowing them to come up with their own interpretations, and then these have sort of perpetuated or propagated, you know, in all different ways.
Yeah, and it's like I feel like it's my purpose in life to make it more accessible to a Western culture. So hopefully that'll change after my book comes out. But anyway, so what's your last question or your next question?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for someone who's not conditioned into this ideology or school of spiritual thought, the concept of evil, and I know again that's a judgment, but what do you say to the person who's like, well, all right, if evil just goes away if I don't focus on it, then how do you explain this going on over here? You know what I mean?
Well, I do think that everything happens for a reason. Everybody is on their own journey. I think there is such a thing as simulation theory, you know, so that if something is happening over here that's not part of your journey, then it doesn't matter. First of all, you know,
I think that's the key piece too. Yeah. I had an experience similar to this in Costa Rica where there was a riot because they were changing the tax laws, and for the people, everything was going up. For anybody who had ever worked for government and their family, and even if they worked there for 2 years, no changes. And so everybody in this country just went nuts. But you know, you would hear these reports. The neighbors were saying, "Oh my God, there's, you know, looting and rioting and everything." In my world, I didn't see any evidence of this. It was so weird. You would hear about it in the paper. You would hear about it from neighbors talking about it. But in my world, on that vibrational level, I didn't see any evidence of this. It was probably that, you know.
Yeah, and it's not to say that we don't feel empathetic. I mean, you can still feel empathy and you can feel compassion for everybody else. So you never want to, like, again, because it's a judgment. So you never want to judge somebody else. But I did see a fascinating little documentary about the idea, an interpretation of evil is fear, is that it's the manifestation of fear, which I kind of love. So I think there are people who live in fear. And there are people who live in fear so much that it is manifested. Now, and we have no control. So it's not like it's manifesting in the fear that they think, you know, it's going to be, but it is fear manifested. So I think that's one thing. And also, I was just going to say really quickly that I think there's also, the 2 hamburger dilemma. Have you heard about that?
No, tell me.
Wicca book. It's like you've got 2 hamburgers and you see a homeless guy on the street. Do you give him your second hamburger? And
I'm a vegetarian, so you can have
okay, fine. Or it could be a veg burger. But the idea is kind of, well, that person, and you've talked about this. You talked about this, I think, in the first episode, is that person in theory is living a life and a path and a journey that they pre-chose or that was predetermined. So who are we? So who are we to come in and say, no, you need food? Or no, because maybe part of your life is to experience hunger, and that's your journey. Now, that's a radical example, again, super controversial, but I think that's the other side of fear manifested.
I get you. And actually, one thing that you just said there too, that jives with something that I was watching in one of these videos on Taoism. So the idea of, society kind of, we have government and police and all these things to protect us from evil,
Right.
and focusing on the element that we don't want and creating society in that way instead of, the Taoist way would be, well, if you don't focus on that, it goes away. And so, just where you put your focus,
Yeah,
things
but I also want to say
there.
is that I do think it's important, because I've had people say this to me, close people to me, it's like, well, does that mean, you just turn a blind eye? And I, one of the reasons why I like living in New York is because I don't want to forget. And I don't want to just live in a bubble and forget that there is extreme poverty and there is extreme injustice, and like what in New York, we see that on every street corner, you know what I mean? It's very visible. So I think that I don't want to say that it disappears entirely, and that I don't want to necessarily look at it, but I want to look at it with compassion or without judgment and all of that, and be able, part of my journey, I think, is to live in harmony with it, and which is challenging, but
yeah, not an easy journey. Yeah. All right, cool. Those are my questions.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
So, oh gosh, we've gone a little over. So I'm just going to wrap up really quickly with like different ways you can cultivate your own Tao. One is like Tai Chi. There's a lot of, and I know a lot of Taoists do Qigong as well, which I don't know anything about, but it's about this idea of movement and passing the energy. I love Tai Chi because I'm an empath and I can feel myself moving my energy around. It feels so good. It's a cleanse, and then also I've heard, I don't know that much about it, but I've heard about, it's a Taoist practice where there's certain poses that you get into that represent different things. So there might be one for money, there might be one for job security or for family. And the idea is you get into the pose and you meditate and contemplate, and that's supposed to open up that chakra or whatever it is.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So movement is a big one. Nature, spending time in nature, of course. Looking within, quieting those voices and noises around you. This is what pandemania has afforded us, is that we are stuck indoors and we can do that. And that's why I think it was such a blessing. Giving up attachment and judgments, obviously that's a practice that takes a long time, but every time, and I try to talk about this in my book, every time I feel what I call a discomfort, because I don't want to make a judgment on it, but if I start to feel like I'm going on the wrong path, or I'm angry or sad or hurt, which are all still real things, then I'm like, there's something underneath that. What is causing that? And then I try to dig until I can find the judgment or attachment. There's always a judgment and or attachment behind it. So that's one way of doing that. And then of course, cultivating this idea of time is relative, which just takes time to really get into your bones.
Yeah. And I think too, raising your vibration too, to be able to even conceptualize these things. So everything works together. Yeah.
Exactly. And then of course, one of the reasons why I love Taoism is because it goes along with my whole catchphrase of there's always another way, because all of these different ways, all these different paths that you choose is all part of the Tao, because we are one.
Love it.
Yeah. So awesome. Do you have any words?
No.
Okay, great.
Beautiful job. That was great.
Yes. Thank you so much for talking with me and for tuning in, for all of you at home. And we will be back next week.
Yes. Thanks so much, everybody. Hope you enjoyed.
Okay. Bye.